Okay, so we're continuing here. And what I'm going to do now is read a section from here, which you can see. And this will help you to understand the shadow from the point of view of Carl Gustav Jung, who knew all about it. And he spent his lifetime's work on that. And this is what we have to do if we're going to evolve and stop projecting all of our stuff, all of our pain, all of our childhood wounding onto other people. Because if we look at the mess of society, all that's really taking place is that people, not all, but generally people are having a really hard time through early years. And, that gets projected. How are we going to stop that in humanity? I don't know. But as each of us takes responsibility in our adult selves, then we're going to make the world a better place. So the shadow, there goes. So whereas the contents of the personal unconscious are acquired during the individual's lifetime, the contents of the collective unconscious are invariably archetypes that were present from the beginning. Their relation to the instincts have been discussed everywhere. The archetypes most clearly characterized from the empirical point of view are those which have most frequent and most disturbing influence on the ego. These are the shadow, the anima, and the animus. So the anima and the animus, again, he explains in this book, which is a separate chapter. And the anima and the animus, it's the male and the female and the female in the male. And it's like we have that within us. So we have these attributes within us, each of us. The man has aspects of the feminine and the female has aspects of the masculine. And if we have damaged aspects, for instance, myself, the father figure, if we've experienced hardship, or for some of us not had a father, then we've got a distorted view of what that image is. And ultimately, the father, we would want to be the hero, because then the feminine is able to know her value. And the same for the male being nurtured, that if he's been overly nurtured or under nurtured, then he's missing aspects, and then that becomes a shadow side in us that's not integrated. So then the most accessible of these and the easiest to experience is the shadow, for its nature can in large measure be inferred from the contents of the personal unconscious. The only exceptions to the rule are those rather rare cases where the positive qualities of the personality are repressed, and the ego in consequence plays an essentially negative or unfavorable role. So again, if we've got positive qualities that are being repressed through society, that, for instance, that we can't be ourselves, and that we have to follow along and the expectations. So we might be a genius, but we're being put off by being told, that we've got to follow other people's rules, and we will repress that. And he goes on to say that the shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. To become conscious of it involves reorganizing the dark aspects of the personality as present and real. This act is the essential condition for any kind of self-knowledge, and if therefore as a rule meets with considerable resistance, indeed, self-knowledge as a psychotherapeutic measure frequently requires much painstakingly work extending over a long period of time. Now, what happens, a lot of people won't look at their shadow. It's not, we're not doing it on purpose until we have like a meltdown, or we have a loss. We might have a loss of a relationship, a loss of a job, we might have loss of health, or along those lines. So we have a loss, and then we're triggered into this looking at our own shadow. And people, will often say, like, well, see horrible things happen in this world, and we'll point fingers, and we'll say, I would never do that, and how disgusting, or what. We'll project this, sort of pureness, purity maybe onto, the world, that that we wouldn't do something. But if we look at something like, as an example, the World War, where Hitler would have made, where people followed him, and right now we're being forced into rules and regulations, and that maybe we would never have imagined that we would have followed. So we have to look at the shadow aspects in us so that we can evolve and heal them and own them, ownership, that we're not nice all the time. We have parts of us that are a bit unruly, and that's Lilith as well, the unruliness, but we're healing that shadow. So closer examination of the dark characteristics, that is the inferiorities constituting the shadow, reveals that they have an emotional nature, a kind of autonomy, and accordingly, or an obsessive or better possessive quality. Emotion, incidentally, is not an activity of the individual, but something that happens to him. So we can agree with that emotions happen to us. We don't choose our emotions. Effects occur usually where adaptation is weakest, and at the same time, they reveal the reason for its weakness, namely a certain degree of inferiority and the existence of a lower level of personality. On this lower level, when it's uncontrolled or scarcely controlled, emotions behave more or less like a primitive who is not only the passive victim of his effects, but singularly incapable of moral judgment. Although with insight and goodwill, the shadow can to some extent be assimilated into the conscious personality experience, and shows that there are certain features which offer the most obstinate resistance to the moral control and prove almost impossible to influence. These resistances are usually bound up with projections. So, the resistances would be in part Pluto in astrology, and bound up with projections which are not recognized and such, and their recognition is a moral achievement beyond the ordinary. While some traits peculiar to the shadow can be recognized without too much difficulty as one's own personal qualities, in this case, both insight and goodwill are unavailing because the cause of emotion appears to lie beyond all possibility of doubt in the other person. No matter how obvious it may be to the neutral observer that it is a matter of projections, there is little hope that the subject will perceive this himself. He must be convinced that he throws a very long shadow before he is willing to withdraw his emotionally toned projections from their object. And we can see, with the political thing that's going on with the COVID thing and the things that are being projected, they're to do with our emotions around certain things, and our emotions generally will come from our early imprints as well. So we may think we're thinking for ourselves, and we may think that we're making our own choices, but often, we've got imprints that we're acting out, or, the sadnesses or the loss, abandonment and betrayal from childhood. And that's being enacted out as adults. And this is why most relationships, don't quite work out. Like, they start off great, there's all of that love, and then they begin to get chip away because we start projecting on each other. But there's a way around that. And as we begin to own our own shadow, we begin to see that other people are what they're doing. So we stop all of this reacting. We stop that dance of in reaction to another, because we can see clearly what's going on. Then he says, no matter how obvious it may be to the natural observer that it is a matter of projections, there is little hope that the subject will perceive this himself. He must be convinced that he throws a very long shadow before he is willing to withdraw his emotionally toned projections of their object. And most of us don't want to own up that we're projecting as well. That's the other funny thing. Even though we'll know we're doing it, and we still don't want to own up. And that's okay too, but the path is, to look at the shadow. So he says, let us suppose that a certain individual shows no inclination whatsoever to recognize his projections. The projection making factor then has a free hand and can realize its object, if it has one, or bring about some other situation characteristic of its power. As we know, it's not the conscious subject, but the unconscious which does the projecting. So it's not, we don't consciously project, we unconsciously project, which makes it much trickier, because then we have to look at all of our unconscious stuff. Hence, one meets with projections, one does not make them. The effect of projection is to isolate the subject from his environment, since instead of a real relation to it, there is now only an illusory one. Projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face. In the last analysis, therefore, they lead to an erotic or autistic condition in which one dreams a world whose reality remains forever unattainable. The resilient sentiment, I can't read this bit, incompletude maybe, and the still worse feeling of sterility, and in their turn explained by projection as the malevolence of the environment, and by means of the vicious cycle of isolation is intensified. The more projections are thrust in between the subject and the environment, the harder it is for the ego to see through its illusions. He explains a 45-year-old patient who had suffered from a compulsion neurosis since he was 20, had become completely cut off from the world, once said to me, "But I can never admit to myself that I've wasted the best 25 years of my life." A little bit more. It is often tragic to see how blatantly a man bungles his own life and the lives of others, yet remains totally incapable of seeing how much the whole tragedy originates in himself, and how he continually feeds it and keeps it going. Not consciously, of course, for consciously he is engaged in bewailing and cursing a faithless world that recedes further and further into the distance. Rather, it is the unconscious factor which spins the illusions that veil his world. So that would be Neptune in astrology, the veil, you know, the rose-colored glasses. And what is being spun is a cocoon, which in the end will completely envelope him. And actually, you know, there is a video which I'll put below this link where a caterpillar, if it's, you know, invaded by parasites, the parasites then get underneath the skin, and then the parasites grow inside the body of the caterpillar, and then they take over the mind of the caterpillar without destroying the organs, and then the caterpillar will end up making a cocoon around the larvae of the like wasp, for instance. Video I've seen, I'll put it below, it's fascinating. And the brain of the caterpillar is then taken over. So he says it, and what is being spun is a cocoon, which in the end will completely envelope him. One might assume that projections like these, which are so very difficult, if it not impossible to dissolve, would belong to the realm of the shadow. That is, to the negative side of the personality. This assumption becomes untenable after a certain point, because the symbols that then appear no longer refer to the same but to the opposite sex. In a man's case, to a woman, and vice versa. The source of projection is no longer the shadow, which is always of the same sex as the subject, but a contrasexual figure. Here we meet the animus of a woman and the anima of a man, two corresponding archetypes whose autonomy and unconsciousness explain the stubbornness of their projections. And we can see the stubbornness of our projections, particularly in intimate relationships, more so than anywhere else. Through the shadow itself is a motif as well known to mythology as the anima and the animus. It represents first and foremost the personal unconscious, and its content can therefore be made conscious without too much difficulty. It differs from the anima and the animus, and whereas the shadow can be seen through the recognized fairly easily, the anima and animus are much further away from consciousness, and its normal circumstances are seldom, if ever, realized. With a little self-criticism, one can see through the shadow, so far as its nature is personal, but when it appears in an archetype, one encounters the same difficulties as the anima and the animus. In other words, it is quite within the bounds of possibility for a man to recognize the relative evil of his own nature, but it is rare and a shattering experience for him to gaze into the face of absolute evil. So this is really beautiful work. The first chapter in this book, he talks about the ego, which I'm going to make a video this week on that. It's a couple of pages. But this work is phenomenal, and it is the research into the phenomenology of the self. So looking back to the chart briefly, you know, Neptune is the, you know, beyond this realm, and the rose-colored sunglasses. Chiron is the wound. The moon is our emotions and, you know, our projections, our ego self in childhood. Ego has got a bad name in spirituality, but ultimately ego, we need a, if we've got a healthy ego, we can do great things in this world. It's the unhealthy ego that's the problem. And generally that's below the surface in the unconscious as well, because of our early imprints. So we have to look at ourselves in order to pick this to bits. Mars is to do with our libido, not just sexual. Jung would talk of the libido as being the psyche. Lilith is our shadow, the male and the masculine and the feminine. Uranus is to do with limitations and past life trauma. The North Node is the path that we're moving towards. Then we've got Venus, and that's to do with our needs and how we hear ourselves and our values, inner needs. And as it rules Taurus, but as the ruler of Libra, it's actually to do with our interactions with each other and each other's needs. And then we got Mercury, which is 88 days around the chart, and it's very speedy, and it's to do with the communication, like I'm communicating now, and it's to do with siblings. It holds the third house. Gemini also rules Gemini and Virgo from different angles. The sun is our will, it's who we are, we shine. And then the South Node is the past life. We've got then Pluto, birth, death, transformation, transmutation, Jupiter, law, spirituality, overseas travel, truth, higher education, and grandeur, and, can be dogma, different octaves of it. And then Saturn is the restriction, and it's patriarchy and karma, and father in the sense of, the archetype of father, not just the birth father and such. So there you go. I'm going to leave it there for today. If you want a chart reading with me, then book me, and subscribe as well if you have not. Thanks for watching, and that's it. I'm going to leave it there. Catch you later. Thank you.